Alright, I'm going to do a review of the Mancraft HPA engine. Mancraft is based out of Poland, and they've developed this HPA engine for V2 engines, or more accurately for M4s, M16s, and SR25 style guns. These are the parts that come with the HPA engine. You have the engine and lower gearbox assembly, I guess. You have the grip mount. You have screws for the grip mount that are attached in this little orange tube here, and here are the screws for it. A selector plate, a buffer tube, spacer and nut, and this is for the mag release, and I'll show how that's used. It also includes this airline. I believe it's a 6mm airline, and I'm not sure what the fitting's for on the end, but I won't be using that anyway. But that came in the box also. So the Mancraft HPA engine, I believe it's called a PDiK, and I'm not entirely sure what that stands for. I'll have to go check that out on the website again. Is a semi-only HPA engine that doesn't require any batteries. It's entirely mechanical, and it's again designed as a semi-only system. I'm going to start by demonstrating how this engine works before I install it into a lower receiver. I'm just going to use a little pigtail here and attach the airline to this Y adapter and attach some air. It's kind of convenient not having to worry about a battery in this case. But you notice as soon as I plug in the air, the nozzle retracts. I'm going to release the air pressure there. So the nozzle without any air pressure is fully forward, which is kind of nice. That allows you to do air seal tests because the nozzle's all the way up there. But once you apply air, the airline going through the orange goes through this valve, which is a normally open valve, and pressurizes this poppet cylinder here, which actually retracts the nozzle. At this point, the orange is pressurized, and the yellow, which is used to charge the engine itself, goes to the back of the engine back here and pressurizes a cylinder inside this main cylinder, which I'll show in a second. There's also a one-way valve attached to the trigger or the poppet cylinder. And why this is in place, it's so when you disconnect the air from the engine, pressure stays inside the system, which keeps the nozzle pulled back. If there wasn't this one-way valve, every time you detach the engine, every time you detach the air, the nozzle would go forward. So if I detach the air, it would basically do that. Now what would happen is if you've got this in a gun and you've got your magazine in place and you detach your air, this would pop forward and it would push another BB into your hop-up. And every time you plug and unplug your air, you start loading your hop-up with BBs. So they added a one-way valve here, keeps it retracted. You can attach and detach as many times as you need to, and you won't overpack your hop-up with BBs. Just remember at the end when you're done and you've got your mag pulled out, you pull the trigger to release the pressure in that cylinder, and that keeps your system not pressurized when you're packing up your gun. Okay, so you essentially just pressurize the system and you activate it with this is a standard M4 trigger, which has been slightly modified so it activates this valve that's inside this lower. And what it's really doing is it's cutting off the air to the poppet cylinder and venting out a little hole inside this housing. So every time you push it, releases the air, the nozzle springs forward and releases the air inside the main cylinder out the nozzle. It's actually very quiet. This is at 80 psi. The spring action of what's going on in here actually makes as much noise as the nozzle and the air shooting out itself. On a gun with a nice foam banana attached to the end of it, actually makes it very, very quiet, and I'll add that, demonstrate that at the end of this video. But essentially, here's the action. The throw of the trigger is very long, just because it's a mechanical based system. The throw is just very long, and it's actually very difficult. There's a lot of force against it. For those used to the electronically controlled HPA engines, this is a much stiffer trigger throw. It's not a little micro switch. So there's no real option of putting a speed trigger on here. I suppose you can do something to make it so the trigger sits right there, but it's still a very long throw. Regardless, not having electronics, no battery, it's kind of convenient. It's very quiet, and I'll show later as well that it's also very consistent. the way that it distributes air through the cylinder, which I'll also show, makes it a very consistent and very quiet engine. Now, there are some other interesting little quirks about this Mancraft system. It's designed as a V2 gearbox replacement, but it's really specifically designed for an M4, an M16, or an SR25. It comes with an M4 style selector plate, which is really just here to activate the safety lever, which keeps the trigger from activating the valve. It has a cylinder extra threaded part here on the front, and what that is allowed to do is put an additional spacer on the front of this cylinder for an SR25, which has an elongated gearbox. So by adding a spacer on here and putting an SR25 nozzle, it allows this to work inside an SR25. So it's conveniently set up and ready to do that. Now, one of the interesting things about this, I'm going to release the air there, is that it uses standard AEG nozzles. And I'll take apart the engine so you can start to see how this is put together. This front cylinder will come right off, and you can see the mechanism here, which actually pushes the nozzle forward. This spring is what pushes the nozzle forward. Well, there's this little brass nut, clever little nut that's on the end here, which essentially captures a standard AEG nozzle. Standard M4 AEG nozzle fits right inside the cradle of this brass fitting, and that goes on here, and it again helps to have an AEG nozzle that has an O-ring in it, which helps keep the air seal very good. So you take this AEG nozzle, put it on here, and you can then just screw this fitting back on, and that holds the nozzle in place. Very clever. I like how that was designed. So you can put an SR25 nozzle on here, or actually just about any nozzle will fit on the end of that, and with maybe a little bit of adapting, you can actually get this to fit in other styles of guns. So there you go. That's a nice little feature. So how does this engine actually work? Well, let's take it apart real quickly, and you can actually see some of the internals for what makes this HPA engine function. It's held in place by 4 screws to separate the upper and the lower. These little tiny screws here. And let's take this lower assembly off. Alright, and this pulls away. I'm going to go ahead and detach the yellow one, the yellow airline. Now this is the trigger valve down here, and it's attached by barbed fittings, which are kind of a real pain to work with. In order to remove them, you actually have to cut that fitting, cut the nylon to pull this off the fitting. So I'm just going to leave it attached for now. But there's a picture of the, maybe you can see that, that's the valve that's activated by the trigger. Again, it's a normally open valve, so as soon as you plug in air, it pressurizes this poppet or trigger cylinder. So let me take this apart here. I'm going to go ahead and open it up so you can actually see how this functions. Alright, this cylinder part here is really just a part that holds it all together. The real working part are these innards here. There is this bolt, which is actually the firing bolt of the engine. This is the recharge port on the bolt. And what it does is it recedes into this middle cylinder. This middle cylinder actually contains the air that is shot out the nozzle. And what happens is, when this is retracted back, this valve is opened and it charges this middle cylinder right here. As soon as you pull the trigger and release the air pressure, this large spring pushes this cylinder forward, which also pushes the nozzle forward on this spring up here at the front. And it basically pulls this backward, which pulls this out of an O-ring port in the cylinder and releases the air. So in this state here, it's charged. As soon as you pull it back, it opens it up and it seals the charging hole. Or there's actually 2, the charging holes on this bolt. So the only amount of air that can go out the nozzle is what's contained inside the center cylinder. I like to call that sort of the metered poppet. It's not open to the air coming from the tank as it's firing, which I actually like, and which can make this a very efficient system. And that only the air that's in here will be fired. If you can hold the trigger down all day long, and that's all that will go out. until you release and let it recharge itself. All right, that's basically how this engine works. It's relatively straightforward. It's pretty easy to assemble and maintain. The mount points on here are these small little brass tubes that are threaded. It's a very shallow threading to attach these brass tubes to the cylinder, so I never mess with these screws here. I don't want to ruin the threading at all. It's just kind of an interesting way it's all put together, but it does seem to work. These actually don't have to be airtight here. That's not under pressure. So you rotate it so this all fits together back here, and then you put it back together with all these little tiny screws. Now, the real trick of putting this into a lower assembly, when you're going to want to take all this extra air line fittings off. I'm going to take off the one-way valve, take off the Y adapter, and then start with the lower receiver. This is where you would put the pistol grip bracket. That's all this is. This is designed to fit inside the lower receiver and hold the grip in place. And let's see if I can get this to fit down in here. I'm actually using a VFC body here. In fact, it's a Polar Star gun. I just happen to have this as my test bed body. But you put this bracket inside the lower receiver. Takes a little work to get that to seat properly in there. And here comes a real interesting part. Now you need to attach the grip. Now the way this is designed using stamped steel or bent steel, a little bit of welding there, is there's no captured nuts here. They give you this orange tube with the nuts in it. And this is going to be a real trick, but you essentially have to attach your grip, put the screw through the grip, and then attach it with the nuts on this side. And I'm sure there's some technique for doing this efficiently, maybe doing it on its side. But one interesting thing is these nuts are socket head nuts and not Phillips, and so you need to have a tool like this that could reach inside of a grip. If you try to do it with just a regular hex key, you're going to get real frustrated trying to get these grip screws put in here. I guess a real benefit to doing it this way is once you've got the grip on here, you really don't have to remove it. So I've inserted the grip screw there, and now you have to sort of fish this down in here so it gets to the top of it. This is where you have to play some games, and it might help to have multiple people do this for you. Or hold it. And let's see if I can capture that. No, I haven't. I think this is the technique to do it. Put the screw in and hold it in place with the wrench or the hex key. Put the nut at the top and then screw it in place. And I think it actually can capture it that way. There you go. So the nuts are off and they're down inside there. And then I think to really make it tight, you may need to use a needle nose plier and then really tighten that down to get your grip held on there properly. All right, there you go. That's not very fun, but once that's in place, your grip is now part of the lower receiver, and it just works this way. So here's what you do. The engine actually can come in and out, again with the grip staying on here. To put the engine into the gun, you have to thread these air lines through the small hole on either side of this welded plate at the bottom here. So again, a little bit of assembly gymnastics here to get these air lines through. Let's go ahead and see if we can get these one on each side. All right. At this point, it actually helps to have some needle nose pliers handy again to pull the air lines up and out. There you go. All right. Now to put this engine in the gun, you actually can put your selector plate on here. It's not a real good selector plate. It's kind of bent and folded steel. It's not very thick. And you have to move the trigger back. That's an important thing to remember. Trigger has to be held back while the engine is being pushed in. So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to hold this trigger back as I slide this engine down and then pull the air lines so they fit through the grip. There you go. Again, it's important that the trigger be held down. I'm going to push the rear receiver pin through. There you go. And you notice the way I'm holding that, you have to have that trigger down so it's out of the way of the flora pin or the trigger pin. Alright, I got a different pin. That other pin wasn't fitting well in the gun. So we'll just use this makeshift one here. Again, the trigger's got to be pulled out of the way. And then the pin can go through. This one goes all the way through. There you go. So that's just a temporary one anyway. So there's the pin and the rear bolt. So your gun needs to have both a pin and a bolt, a pin for the trigger and a body pin to hold this engine in place. It's not the most sturdy mounting mechanism. It really should be held by the grip, but that's the design of this engine. I guess when the hop-up's attached to the front of this, it'll actually help hold this in place. Now to put the mag release in, because this doesn't have a mag release ring, you insert your mag release and then you use this brass collar that they provide. Okay, once that brass cylinder's in there, then you can assemble your mag release, and then you can go to the last part, which is assembling the grip plate and the Y connector. Okay. The fire select doesn't work all that well. That plate is really loose inside there. I think it actually does act as the safety. It does push it forward, but as you move it back and forth, it can bind up a little bit. That plate really needs to be replaced with something more, well, something better designed for this. It's just not working there. That's not even holding it. All right, I'm going to ignore the safety for the moment, but that's not actually functioning. Okay. Anyway, let's get to how you attach this bottom part here. So here you have, I'm going to take this part off. The orange goes to the one-way valve, and the yellow goes to the Y adapter. Now all of this has to be stuffed down inside the grip, so you kind of have to fold it around, and then you push this all into the grip. Now I have here a grip plate. This is a 3D printed one, but it's representative of any kind of grip plate that has a 1/2 inch hole on it. Notice that doesn't fit all the way through, and I'll show you where that can be a problem. I'm going to go ahead and attach my airline to this through the grip plate, and then mount the grip plate in here. And you basically sort of stuff all this down inside here, and then you can use the screws to hold it all in place. But some of you may have noticed that there could be a real problem with the way that this is assembled, because these are all push to connect fittings. Okay, with the way this is, the locking collar on the push to connect fitting is actually pressing up against the motor plate. So it'd be very easy to remove the airline. In fact, all you have to do is pull on it and it comes right out, because you're essentially pushing this push to connect lock against the motor plate. So this isn't going to work. This will come out every single time. What really needs to happen is you have to have a hole in your motor plate that's large enough for this Y adapter to come out. And so it's resting on the shoulders. If it's on the shoulders of the Y adapter, then you won't have this problem. But be aware, drill a bigger hole than a 1/2 inch. It probably needs to be more like 3/4 of an inch to get that air fitting to fit out, and then and this will actually be held in place properly. So another quirky thing with this engine. Beyond that, that's basically the install. To take it out, all you actually really have to do is detach all your airline fittings, take these two pins out, and this engine will come out of the gun for service or any maintenance that's needed. And then the upper slides right on like any other normal M4 setup. There you go. Let's take this upside down. Alright, it locks in place, and the hop-up fits nicely right into the face of the cylinder, so there's really no problem there. It actually shoots well. Again, I'll be showing you some shooting video right after this. It's very quiet. It has a really awkward spring sound to it. I can demonstrate here when it fires. I don't think you'll actually hear that when you're out on the field. At least your opponent won't hear it. So if you fire this, there's a little spring sound you can hear here. But you can actually hear how quiet this is. Very quiet. So if you're a semi-only shooter, this can work pretty well for you actually. Once you get past some of the oddities of how you assemble and build this, once it's in place, it'll actually work pretty well. And fixing this little grip problem that goes on here. But it's pretty quiet. If you can get used to the trigger throw, it'll do its job. It's very consistent. You know, I'll also show some chrono. So there you have it, the Mancraft HPA semi-auto engine.